welcome to the National World War II Museum's podcast series, Service on Celluloid. Each week, our in-house experts sit down with special guests to discuss depictions of World War II on film. Sit back and get ready for a lively debate that will reveal the good and bad of how Hollywood shows the 20th century's most dramatic event. My name is Seth Paradin, historian and digital content manager here at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, and as always, we're sitting down with
Dr. Christelle Lefaucheur, research historian at the Institute for the Study of War and Democracy.
And today our special guests are Jason Dawsey, Dr. Jason Dawsey, Defense POW MIA Accounting Agency Special Projects Historian.
Thanks for having me.
And last but certainly not least, Kim Geis, Assistant Director for Curatorial Services here at the museum.
Hi, thanks.
Today we'll be discussing the 1943 film Bataan. The film focuses on the American withdrawal and defensive fighting on the Bataan Peninsula in early 1942, following the Japanese invasion of the Philippines. Bataan was directed by Tay Garnett and written by Robert Hardy Andrews. It stars Robert Taylor, Lloyd Nolan, Thomas Mitchell, Robert Walker, and Desi Arnaz. The film was a box office success when it was released during the war. So, as we always do, guys, let's start our discussion by asking, and I'll ask Jason because you're sitting across from me. In your opinion, how accurate is Bataan?
I think the part about it that's especially accurate is the issue of delaying action by the American Army. So one of the things the film really conveys to people, I think it's actually one of the most powerful parts of it, is a case where the U.S. is in retreat. And you get that from the opening scene with the air attack on the column, that there's confusion and chaos on the American side. And the film then shifts to the story about these 12, 13 guys who have to hold the Japanese off, to slow them down, to delay them as much as possible. In that sense, I think the film is quite accurate. They're buying time. They're buying time for others. And that part of the film, I think, is where its accuracy is at its best.
Kim, what about you?
There were other aspects of it, too. I agree totally, but there were other aspects of it, too, that I think brought out important elements of the war in the Philippines. And I was reminded of something that the late Dr. Lester Tenney said. He remarked about how the army in the Philippines was a very unusual army. We were infantrymen without boots, we were airmen without planes, tankers without tanks, and so I think that element of this kind of ragtag bunch of people who were ill-equipped and just kind of thrown together without any planning, I think that came through in the film as well.
Yeah, I would agree with both of you. For me, the most interesting part is, dare I say, could have been any rag group of men. It could have been in Battle of the Bulge, it could have been in the Philippines. For me, the most interesting aspect is kind of a determination and reaction to the situation they are in, which is very quickly they notice it's a desperate situation, and yet they make the decision or they follow the order first, maybe originally a little unwillingly, but then they decide to fight, knowing that it's for a good cause, and how they manage to do that and die one by one.
Yeah, I agree with everybody here. It has its, like any war movie, it has its accuracies and its inaccuracies. But I agree with you, Jason, and that that's what the Bataan defenders were doing. They were fighting a delaying action. Most, except for maybe the naive, knew that there was no help coming, and that they were destined to either die, escape into the jungles, or be captured. Those were your three options, and that is portrayed very, very well in this film. And Kim, I agree with you too, and that it is the movie portrays the group. I guess you could say it's a rather large squad, but they portray a bunch of different guys from all kinds of different aspects of the United States military, mostly Army, one Filipino and a sailor, and two Filipinos and a sailor and a pilot. I forgot about the pilot, and in that respect, it's also accurate. Except for it would have been a little more accurate to have more Filipinos than it would have been Americans. Yeah. But again, remember who the movie was made for in 1943. But the fact that they put a Filipino in at all, or two, two, at all is encouraging, frankly. But
Yeah.
but that's true. I mean, the defenders, especially towards the end of the campaign, the defenders of Bataan were a ragtag. It was kind of basically whoever could still stand and pull a trigger. So, like I was saying, it's accurate in that it does portray the ragtag group of American and Filipino defenders of Bataan, and April-ish 1942. They never really give you a date, but one would assume that it's April 42. This movie was made in 1943, and this is I think the only movie that we've done so far on this podcast that was made during the war so far, and it has a definite tone to it for sure, and it's I think it's readily apparent. There's several different tones. There's your flag waving heroic tone. There's your dark tone. There's several tones to it, but. Would you guys classify this as a rallying cry for the American public?
I think it's definitely that. Like when you watch, I actually went back right before we came over here to do this to look at the trailer from 1943, and it may have set the world's record for alliteration in a trailer. It was the blazing story of the battling boys of bedeviled Bataan. I actually practiced that a few times to actually see if I could say it there. And so the film definitely has that sense about defiance. That the trailer had a couple of quotations from MacArthur. It had quotations in there from Army nurses who claimed this film is completely accurate and based on fact. And yeah, to rally the American public. I think that for most people who thought about Bataan in 1943, it was associated with defeat and surrender. And when you go see the film, you're going to get a story about defiance and about men fighting to the last, and a group, a kind of ragtag group that really does come together. So you could see how this movie would have meant a lot for American audiences when the war was still very much, it was not, people were not sure yet what the outcome of it was going to be.
And I mean, the fall of the Philippines dominated the headlines. Or I should say the fall of the Philippines, the invasion of the Philippines and subsequent fall of the Philippines dominated American headlines from December 1941 until really May when Corregidor surrendered of 42. And I mean, everybody knew what was going on in the Philippines. I mean, and it was this movie, it's not surprising that it was made for many reasons, not the least of which is, as I said, it dominated headlines. And then two, is that it does give you that aura of defiance. We know we're going to lose. We know there's no hope, but we're not giving in, kind of a deal. Kim?
Yeah, I mean, trying to put myself in the a movie theater seat in 1943. Thinking about what it is like to be watching this film. I think certainly a rallying cry comes to mind. Yeah.
Well, for me, I think there's two additional things that the movie is trying to do. The first one is when we talk about rallying cries, also kind of presenting this rag group as a representative of the country as a whole. We're all diverse, including, and I think we're going to talk about that a little bit more depth later, an African American that's presented as an equal, first time probably in the history of American movie. But also, I think, making it very clear the kind of a one, not the first, but a very strong kind of a dehumanizing of the Japanese, of very much marking the Japanese as the enemy that it was, but in the way that I think could trigger some, if non-existing, and probably everybody was mad at the Japanese. But I think the movie is quite, to 21st century viewer, is quite, I don't know, I was going to say harsh, but quite strong.
I wouldn't necessarily go with that. I think some of the lines that they use when referring to the Japanese are frankly a bit hokey. They call him Mr. Monkey and things like that. And I mean, I know a lot of World War II veterans. I didn't know a single one of them that called him Mr. Monkey. And that's it is what it is. But to kind of pile on what you were saying there, one of the questions I was going to ask is it propaganda?
Oh, yeah.
And to an extent, yes, it is.
Oh, yeah, it is.
Because with the way they refer to the Japanese, and yeah, of course it's propaganda, and the way Tommy Dorsey's coming in over on the radio, and then it's all American boys, and you got your sailor. I can't think of the actor's name, but Robert Walker. Walker's the all American boy. He's done every sort of job in the history of jobs, and he's this happy-go-lucky, gee whiz kind of a guy. And this is very much propaganda, I think. Anyway, what about you guys? What do y'all think?
I agree. It's propaganda. I mean, just in the portrayal of the Japanese in particular, the monkey and no-tail baboons, that was another strange line. But then also, the trailer, Jason, to go back to what you had said earlier, it's like out of the depths, the demon, Japanese devils, that kind of thing. That's certainly, propagandistic.
But there's a lot of scenes where they're depicted as, duplicitous and treacherous, which, again, it's not like the enemy that we're fighting against, but we might in some way, like potentially the German army, respect from a long tradition of armed force. The Japanese, there's no respect at all for them. They're just those evil, I was going to use a word I'm not supposed to use, side with the B. And again, they're really duplicitous. And I think the movie, there's several scenes that makes that clear. They pretend to be dead, they pretend to surrender, and then really attack back. All those things that, increase our animosity towards them.
Which, it wasn't necessary to increase animosity towards the Japanese because...
To consolidate.
Right. After Pearl Harbor,
Yeah.
Yeah. And this is not surprising in any way, shape, or form, in my opinion. And, some of the tricks, quote, air quotes here, that they show that the Japanese do in the movie, this is based on fact. They did those things, and not saying they were the only ones, but, it was a trait, shall we say. But Jason, you were going to say something.
Yeah, I was just going to say that there's this kind of, there's this elevation of the kind of all-American, young men that you really get, and you see that come together. You mentioned about Robert Walker's character. He's like saying "sir" to the sergeant. And he's like, you don't say "sir" to a sergeant. But he's that guy that. He is sort of this all-American guy, and he really wants to make a mark. And obviously that's going to mean killing Japanese and showing what he's capable of and the like. And I think that for audiences, when I was watching, I was just thinking, what would audiences, who would they have identified with? Would it have been with Dane, the like? I don't know. I think maybe I think his name was Perkett.
Yeah.
Does that
Perkett,
sound right?
yeah. Perkett.
That Walker played. I tended to think that he was the guy that people would have rallied to.
I agree.
And whereas the Japanese, they're sort of these anonymous soldiers that come out. Obviously, they're treacherous and the like, and they have all sorts of dirty methods of fighting that are shown there, and one can argue about whether that was exactly accurate or was it just a way of trying to dehumanize them. But that's I think what the film works off of is this way of celebrating the American spirit and at the same time like emphasizing the treacherousness of the Japanese.
Absolutely. Agreed.
Yeah, Perkett's such an interesting character because he is, this young, naive boy, I guess, right? But, and what's up with all of his stories? I don't know if he's supposed to be like, the Mickey Rooney, sort of Andy Hardy kind of character, a young comedic, slightly comedic effect with all these jobs. There's no way he could have done all of this.
Absolutely not. But I think, to your point, to what we were just saying, I think he is the character that is to be identified with by most of the American public, by the soon-to-be fighting man. Mm-hmm. Oh, I'm a cowpuncher. This guy was. I'm a movie usher. Oh, this guy was a movie usher too. I forget what other.
A cab driver. He was a mechanic.
150 jobs he had. Either he's the most unreliable employee in the history of employees, and he keeps getting fired, or he's a sensational liar.
We don't know that if he got fired.
But my point is that, and maybe I'm way off, but I think because he did, quote again, air quotes, all these jobs. That character was created to be identifiable with everybody, with everybody who's going to sign up for service in the United States military. And not to say that some guy who is a cab driver in San Francisco is going to go, oh well, hell, I saw this guy, I can go do this. That's not what I'm saying, but he's the identifiable American all apple pie boy that we were trying to portray that filled the ranks of the American military in World War II.
And I think especially what's interesting with this character is that he started very green, have no idea about nothing, and he really grew in this position. And so if you have an audience that say, I never fought, why should I go fight? And it's like, well, when the go get tough, the tough get going. What I say that. I think it's again coming back to Kim's point. Like I watched that, I say, well, he was young and naive like me, and he can do it, and he can be brave, and he can be succeed in what he got to do. But while we're talking about the character, for me, Todd or Burns, I think, is even more interesting because the movie is very clever in giving voice to all those different potential audience members, including the one that are unhappy about what happened at Bataan and that criticizing the government, which happened all the time, all countries during the war. And I think they're giving him this voice, so putting that out there, we rant, we vent, we said our piece, and now at the end again, himself too proved himself to be a courageous, and brave man. And I think that was a very clever move from the scriptwriters.
Yeah. He initially is not a likable character.
Oh, no.
Although
No.
I gotta say, I can identify with him because he's bitching and he has a legitimate complaint about every single thing he says.
Very true.
Everything he says, there's nothing that he says that is inaccurate. Yeah. Nothing. Yeah. He's the one that says, "Ain't nobody coming. Ain't nobody coming to save us."
There's no plane, and MacArthur is not going to send any.
Oh, he had one of the best lines that bury the rest of us face down.
Yeah.
So we were not looking up waiting for these planes to come. That line is so good.
Yeah, it really is. That is an awesome line. And in that regard, about being abandoned, if you will, or nobody coming to save you, is this movie trying to cover a stinging defeat for the United States? And I don't think it's necessarily trying to cover a stinging defeat. I think it's trying to soften it a little bit.
Put a silver lining on it.
Yeah, because, let's be honest. There were a lot of Americans and more Filipino soldiers than American soldiers that surrendered. And, there's a famous line in the famous movie Patton where George Patton says, surrender is hateful to Americans. And to a point, it is. Nobody wants to be known as the ones who gave up and quit, threw up the white flag and, turned around and ran or whatever it may be. And there were, I forget the exact number, but there were tens of thousands of prisoners of war taken in the Philippines. So this is not exactly a glorious page in our history, to steal from a very good book. This is, a very dark point in our American military history. And I don't think it's trying to cover a stinging defeat. I think it's trying to, as you said, Christelle, put a little silver lining around it. What do you guys think?
I agree with that. I think especially, Pearl Harbor was such a traumatic moment for the country, but that was a surprise attack, and so people could blame different individuals for the U.S. not being ready, but that was one day, and so the Philippine campaign, as Seth mentioned, that had dragged on for several months, and the U.S. there are obviously people who pull out, MacArthur leaves, and then those soldiers that are left there that have to surrender. And so it's a different kind of moment even than Pearl Harbor is, and for many of the other, Guam or Wake Island, et cetera, those just didn't have the impact on the public that the Philippines did. And so I think this film was really important for Americans to see something heroic, something salvageable from this defeat, as you mentioned.
I would argue that Wake Island actually did too, because there was the motto, remember Wake Island, remember the Alamo of the Pacific, because of course the Marines fended the Japanese off after their first attack, and the Japanese had to come back and attempt to take the island again. But yes, I agree with you in that it was a prolonged campaign of defeat after defeat after defeat after defeat, and there was no good news. Mm-hmm. Christelle, you can go.
No, I would agree with both of you. But I think the way the movie is kind of tried to capture that and kind of switch this defeat into something a little better than the defeat is with the prologue and the postscript.
Sure.
The prologue is, dare I say, for me, was a little over the top. But I think it definitely framed the film as like, okay, yes, we got our butt kicked. But then in the end, although we did that, we still stood our ground and we kept on fighting for 3 months, and by doing that, we basically probably helped, win the war in the end. I mean, it's a little bit the
stretch,
the overstretched argument that the movie is making, but it's based on also true fact. I mean, because they resisted or fend off the attack from the Japanese for over 3 months, many more men were able to evacuate and then to regroup and to attack after. So.
But I mean, this isn't Dunkirk either. I mean, we didn't pull out,
very true.
100,000 people off the Philippines.
And the one we pull out, we're probably not in good shape. So.
No, that is very true. Very true. How does this movie compare to other World War II films made at other times? And I'll actually throw a little curve in here and compare to World War II movies made at this time during the war, not necessarily 43, but during the war.
Well, Wake Island was made just before that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this one was also a little bit of a reaction to that, to say, hey, we want to do our Pacific kind of glorious, quote, movie. So I don't know. I don't want to say they're similar, but they have the same kind of propagandistic...
Same theme.
Yeah, same thing. Yeah.
Same theme, for sure. I think this is a little bit darker.
Yeah, absolutely.
Than, there's a movie, I don't remember when it was produced. I want to say 42, early 43, called Air Force, which is actually a pretty good flick.
This one is...
It's a pretty good flick. But Air Force it's also centered around the Philippine defeat. But it has its moments of golly gee whiz to it, and this does not. Aside from Robert Waga's character, this doesn't have that at all. It's from the beginning to the end. It's a very, very dark film, which I would argue there's not a whole hell of a lot of World War II movies made during the war
absolutely
that are like that or like this.
And I think we talked about that here before covering other film. If you make a film and you know you're going to have veterans from this particular battle, you have to be really careful about what you do. Because otherwise you're going to have a really big backlash. People that were there or experienced that could say, no, this is not how it happened. So,
But at this point, there were not going to be any veterans who were going to watch this movie and say, that's not how it was at Bataan.
Well, I read that they showed the movie, they pre-screened it to a group of soldiers and press correspondents that had been in Bataan, not during the actual battle or encounter that's depicted in the movie, but during the siege. Yeah. And then they talked about it.
Yeah, I mean, certainly some people got out, but like we discussed in our previous episode about Battleground.
Yeah.
That was made for World War II veterans. That was made for combat vets in the ETO. I would debate this was made for the American public.
I agree.
American public. So you mentioned, Christelle, the prologue and the postscript, the epilogue. What? Let's talk about that. They're very prominent in the movie. And you said, the first one, the prologue is kind of over the top, and it is to a point.
Well, it gets into the idea of what is a life worth, kind of. It's a deep thing, then is it worth all of these lives for these 96 days? Is it worth losing all of the men there? Tens of 70,000, right, Jason, POWs with,
right.
10, 12,000 Americans. Is it worth those lives in captivity, at least, for the 96 days?
There's a line in that I'm looking at it now, and it's a really good line. It's the closing line of the prologue, and it says, "To those immortal dead who heroically stayed the wave of barbaric conquest, this picture is reverently dedicated." And that's it's made for the American public.
Yeah, that's the one for me. Of course, it's 1943, the barbaric conquest is all. But I understand, yes, this is probably how I must have felt. And I have to say, one of the most impressive scenes for me was the second to opening, the attack on the civilian convoy.
Yep.
I thought it was incredibly violent and done with such minimalist, scenes, just the hands sticking out of a pile of rubble. I mean, I was watching it and I was like, whoa, I did not expect that I'd never seen the movie before for a 1943 movie. I think they set the stage right there. We had a little conversation and then we have the scenes right away. And I was very impressed.
Yeah.
And the way that, the defiance is shown from the beginning, I think the guy's on a stretcher, this wounded soldier, and he refuses to relinquish his rifle. Yeah. He's not going, even in the shape that he's in, he's not going to give up his weapon, and that sets the tone for the rest of the film about, there's going to be no give up. There's not going to be any surrender. There's not going to be any sign really of weakness that's going to be shown in the film, and you get it from those opening moments.
But you also have the American humanity. You have the soldier that's carrying a kid on his shoulder. Like, we're the good guys. We're helping the civilians. We're helping the little kids. And look what those Japanese are doing. I think it's so effective in, like, I don't know, it's 45 seconds. The scene is really well done.
It's effective and it's accurate because, the vast, not all of them by any means, but the vast majority of American servicemen who were in the Philippines in 41, 42 had been there for a while. There were a few who arrived a few months before, sure. But like Robert Taylor's character, been there for, I forget how many years he said, it was 3, I think 2 or 3. But I mean, that's very accurate. Those guys had been there a long time. They had assimilated into that culture. They knew the civilians. They knew those civilians knew them. They were, hey Joe, what do you know? That kind of thing. So that was I think that was very accurate and well done. Very well done.
But then there was the one guy who was blinded.
Yep.
And everyone just leaves them in the middle of the street.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure about that.
Yeah.
He keeps on growling and trying to still do
and then
something.
he gets crushed by a burning log.
But again, it's like, it's kind of zooming in on one individual, how, Americans must have felt, like crushed, surprised and crushed by the Japanese murderous, barbaric conquest.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that any Filipino who lived through the Japanese conquest would certainly agree that it was a barbaric conquest, for sure. No doubt about that at all. The depictions of race in this movie, this is interesting. We talked, I think, Christelle, you were the one that mentioned it initially, about the African-American soldier. His name is Epps in the movie. And he plays a very large role. In this movie, he's alive. I forget, exactly when he is killed in the movie, but he's there for better than 3/4 of the film.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which is rather unusual for 1943, So let's talk about that for a second.
Oh, absolutely. One of the producer was, I think his way to pronounce his name is Dory Shari, kind of a liberal northeastern producer, but was really intent on again demonstrated this kind of call to unity and putting aside our domestic problems to show, what United States can do. And he really insisted on having an African-American character. And originally he didn't tell the other fellow scriptwriter because he didn't want them to write into this character really cliche dialogue, especially. He was very careful about that. So I think we will all agree there's still some cliche characteristic. Of course, he wants to be a preacher. He sings the blues and everything. But I think it's so impressive that from the get-go you see him interacting with the fellow engineer or construction guy.
Yep.
And there's no hesitation. They work together. There's not even a moment of feeling uncomfortable being together, even men that never work with them. I mean, it was really impressive. The NAACP was very happy with the movie, and in June 43, they awarded MGM, the producing company, a Scroll of Merit for showing, quote, how superfluous racial and religious problems are when common danger is faced. And a year later, in June 44, they gave another social award for its sympathetic and intelligent portrayal of a black soldier. So, and I would agree with that.
He was a cool character too in the movie.
He's still the one doing the dirty work and digging the graves, but that's fine.
There were other grave diggers in that group. He wasn't the only one with a shovel, for sure.
And his eulogy, I mean, it was wonderful.
It was beautiful.
Yeah.
And people deferred to him as well a couple of
Very
times,
true.
which is really
his eulogy, I think.
And he has
was
this very
beautiful.
good kind of a answer back to Todd's when he said, "There's no plan," and you say, "Well, I reckon that the United States is doing all it can to send planes here." So very, very calm, very polished, and very believing in, I'm not sure about the mission, but very believing that they're in it together and folks home will do whatever they can to help them out.
Yep.
Well, I think that the fact the representation of Epps was so good. I think the actor's name is Kenneth Spencer, and the representation of him was so good that a number of theaters in the Deep South didn't want to show the film, in fact, because of this integrated unit that was being depicted there and where race just wasn't much of an issue at all. They were comrades, and that deeply, not surprisingly, deeply upset a number of segregationists in the South, and who wrote letters, angry letters to MGM about the depiction of the Epps character.
But you mentioned a mixed race unit. I mean, it's not just him.
Exactly.
You have your Mexican from California, who, of course, is Desi Arnaz, which is awesome, and then you have you have your two Filipinos, and there is no segregation in that unit at all. There's nobody calling anybody any kind of a name, even if it's in joke. Nothing. And that I thought that was pretty damn cool for a movie made at this time. I thought that was pretty good.
Absolutely.
And also the fact that the unit is also pretty diverse in terms of age. When I saw the Feingold character, Thomas Mitchell, that Thomas Mitchell plays, I mean, how old
Fantastic
is he?
actor.
He's great, yeah. And he'd won the Oscar in Stagecoach, I think, just 3 or 4 years earlier. And he looks to be, 45, 50? Am I being too generous? I don't know. But,
I think you might be being
maybe
generous.
I'm being too generous.
Yeah, you are. But, again, we'd had this conversation earlier a bit, and he might be a little over the hill, if you will, for sure. But again, a lot of you got to remember, this is the 1940 1940 American Army. Even though, I know it takes place in 42, but these guys, not all of them, but a lot of them who had been in the Philippines for a long time were career soldiers. Yeah. And, I mean, they were corporals and sergeants and stuff like that who'd been in the Army for 20 years, and that's all they knew. So while I agree, he was a little old for sure, it was not uncommon. I mean, look at the pictures of the POWs in the Bataan Death March. There's a lot of guys who are well over the age of 30 in those lines, and they are slick sleeves. They're corporals or privates or sergeants or whatnot, and there's not a whole lot of high-ranking officers in there that that are of that age. So I mean, it's not completely off target. He's a little old for sure, but it's not completely off target. So
the average age of POWs in the Pacific was 27. Yeah. So you have the guys that are much older. But that skewed 2 years older than the European theater, where there were much younger guys.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that actually speaks well. In fact, one reason I brought that up, it speaks well, I think, to the filmmakers that they're not going to try to put younger men in those roles, like Feingold's role. We need to show these men as they were, and some of them were outside that traditional range.
And had bunions.
That's right. Yeah, bathing his feet in the spring. Yeah. That's the bane of all infantry. Let's talk about Robert Taylor, who was an interesting cat, by himself. But his character, Bill, I think his first name is Bill. His last name is Dane. His, Robert Walker calls him he's a hard-boiled man. He's a hard man, that kind of thing. He
can light a match on his neck.
Yeah, you could strike a kitchen match on the back of his neck. He's filled with rage through a lot of this movie. I don't know. Is that an accurate representation of I don't want to say is that an accurate representation of a soldier. I mean, whatever it is, what it is. But he seems to me to be the whereas Robert Walker's the all-American boy, this guy's your G.I. Joe. He's your life taker. He's your soul snatcher. He's the guy that's there to whip everybody into shape. He's your typical sergeant in any movie made during the 1940s and 1950s, in my opinion. Anyway, what do you guys think?
Yeah, I agree. Like when you see just the kind of the physical presence that Taylor has playing Dane, that's how he comes across. I mean, he's a hardened, bitter, difficult individual. I mean, that's how he often portrays himself, and yet he's just the guy you would want in those circumstances. You'd want somebody who is going to fight tooth and nail, and not surprisingly, when you see the kind of way the film closes, that he is that individual. So yeah, I did. I thought that too. Like he is sort of the kind of embodiment of American ferocity when pushed, when challenged.
Yeah.
I think Kim and I disagree. Go ahead, Kim.
Well, I think I didn't see him as being full of rage the entire time. And maybe it's that when pushed, that little addition. I do feel like there was, sort of a switch, maybe. And I feel like he got harder after the captain was killed.
Which is in the opening minutes
super
of the movie.
early, yeah. But, and he kind of says, all right, there's, I'm giving the orders here, sort of, this is no volunteering. I'm going to tell you what to do, and you're going to do it. But yeah, and certainly by the end, he is, crossed over into rage, definitely. But I feel like there are moments where he, where he's not so super rage-filled.
I would agree with that. I think he comes across again as the leader that you need in such a situation. So it's also an argument for you need a guy that knows what he's going to do, and you have to obey the order. So that was well done. And I would agree the rage comes really towards the end. And I have a question actually for you. For me, at the end, he's not just in rage; he's also delirious. He's sick. Yeah. They made it clear that he's, like the other two. We had two that got sick. So it's a mix of deliriousness. I don't know if it's in a word. And delirium. Rage. Yeah, delirium, that's true. Deliriousness. I'm making words. But for me, it was kind of a weird ending because it's like, where is that the states one needs to be able to go full out and kill and kill and kill and kill?
No, but I mean, the way it ends where you don't actually see him die. He's
clear, though.
It's the he's the symbolism.
Yes.
Of, because I mean, again, not everybody was killed or surrendered. A lot of people ran up into the hills and fought a guerrilla war, and one assumes that he dies, but does he? Does he become one of the guerrillas in the Philippine mountains?
I mean, a Kurt.
Who knows,
He's a Kurt.
Yeah, Kurtz. Yeah. But I mean, that happened. So he's the like we were talking about earlier, Jason. He's the symbolic character, the American that doesn't give up. He's going to go to the end.
But he dug his grave.
He dug his own grave.
For sure.
I mean,
he was ready to go. He was ready.
Yeah.
He was ready to go.
Which reminds
Maybe he was
me,
a Boy Scout. He was always prepared.
Yeah, which reminds me, one other thing we didn't talk about when we talk about the Japanese is there's a lot of talk about how the environment, the space, is that the Japanese are way more adept to live here than the American. Mm-hmm. They know the trees, they know the Americans that come here, the food, the temperature, the surrounding, the water is, everything is almost like the place is also against them in a little bit. Like they have to fight double. Mm-hmm. It feels to me that we get this impression.
Which I would argue is inaccurate.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, again, as I said, not everybody had been there for years, no. But there were, by and large, a great deal of American infantry and Filipinos, certainly the Filipinos who had been there for a long time, and they were used to the climate. They were used to the area. They were used to the terrain to a point. So as I was saying, there were a lot of American and Filipino servicemen who knew the terrain. They knew the climate. So it wasn't. I'm not saying that fighting in the jungle is an easy thing by any means, but they knew the terrain. They knew the climate better than the Japanese. I mean, let's be honest. The Japanese were the invading force. So in that respect, I would say that the movie's got a bit of inaccuracy there. Maybe they're trying to cover some things. But speaking of covered, let's talk about one thing that is not covered. That is probably the most famous thing to come out of the fall of the Philippines, and that's the Bataan Death March. It's not even talked about in this movie. And I might add that by 1943, the American public was fully aware of what had happened on the Bataan Death March. They were aware. They didn't maybe have every grisly detail, but it was a known thing. It was a known thing because there were escapees who actually did get back to the United States, one of them being a United States Marine named Austin Schaffner, who was on the Death March, and he got out. And he actually got out of the Philippines with the help of Filipino guerrillas and got back to the United States. Long story with him. We'll get to him later. But he was one of the first guys to break the news of the Bataan Death March to the American media. So they knew, and this is in late 42, early 43. So they knew about this. And this isn't covered in the movie at all. Why do you think that is? Anybody?
Well, it doesn't fit with what the movie is trying to do. I mean, we talked about earlier how, the movie is trying to put like a positive spin, quote unquote, to this defeat. So how do you end with? And then we had a Bataan March, and we lost 10,000 of men. So I don't know. For me, it makes sense that it's not part of that.
It would be out of context. I
Yeah.
agree, but as we said earlier, this is a rallying cry. This is a flag waver. This is everybody it's a call to arms. And if there was one thing aside from Pearl Harbor that really pissed off the American public, it was that. It was the Bataan Death March. I mean, and these are prisoners of war who were executed, wholesale sometimes, and that's something that sticks in the craw of a lot of people.
I mean, maybe some of the details about it were known, but there are still a lot of details about it that aren't known. We don't even know how many people died
Right.
during the march. So, I mean, I feel like maybe some of it was known at the time, and because of the escapees, like you said, details were leaked. But I don't know that it wasn't widely publicized until 1944.
That's what I have too, 44.
It's in
And
newsreels.
where
It's in
like
newsreels in
Time
43.
magazine did, covered it in 44. So, I'd have to go back and look at that. But I thought, at the time of the movie, there wasn't, it wasn't a big story in the American public.
I mean, the film came in June 43. It's incredibly fast. I mean, they start shooting in December 42, and by June 43, it's in the theater. So I agree with Seth that there were some little bits of news, but I don't think it was the full-blown. I think the full-blown came a little after that.
I mean, maybe a bigger thing is that people weren't, the captives were still captive. There's just a big question mark. These guys, many of them were, still suffering, and under incredible.
And how do you make a movie out of
hardship.
that and justify that the Americans still haven't done anything to liberate those guys? I mean, it's a tricky one to do, I think, at that moment in time. And as I say, I don't think it's part of the movie, what the movie is trying to do. It's a different story.
Yeah.
Jason?
Yeah, I was going to say, I think a lot of it has to do with what you mean by known or what you mean by awareness. And I think, so I agree with Seth, there was certainly stories and claims that were in the American press that were there and people believed. But if John Dower's right, he claims that the U.S. government had like a full kind of report ready to go for the American public as early as June or July of 43, right about the time the film came out, but it actually sat on it for another 6 months and then released it in January of 44. And the British released their own stories about atrocities committed against British service members by the Japanese, so they timed these things. And so I wonder if MGM and the makers of the film decided that we're just going to leave that aside for the moment and make a film about, this is my speculation, I don't know this, we're going to make a film about the combat and about the Americans fighting to the last until we know and get some kind of government sign-off or approval or support for making something about the march.
Or they could have been told, too. Exactly.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, the film industry was working very, very closely with the American government and the armed forces, and they're very careful. They ran script by them and the OWI, and it came back, and they would make little change, and I'm not sure they would have had approved so early. I don't know.
Yeah. And that's a good point. It might not have been approved, as you say, but I mean, there were Marines on Guadalcanal who knew about the Bataan Death March. So it was not unknown. But I tend to agree with what you two, Jason and Christelle, said that it, and Kim too. Sorry,
No.
So Kim, you're not here, but that it may have been that the government told them to put the kibosh on it too. I don't know, but either way, it's something that was certainly a horrible aspect of the fall of the Philippines, and it's something that. Really, if you think about it, it's not covered by a whole hell of a lot of movies. There's really not a lot of films that talk about the Bataan Death March in any way, shape, or form. There's,
Is the one about nurses? It's a movie with Glenn Close, the female that marched in Bataan too, I think.
I don't know the film. Back to Bataan.
Yeah,
Starring John Wayne.
but that's still
Which was made 2 years later. There is a scene. Couple of scenes. That's where they get Anthony Quinn at in the movie. They pull him out of the march. They pull him out of the column. But other than that, I can't think of any
Isn't the Purple Heart, that film made in '44 about the Doolittle raid and the Japanese executing some of those flyers, that I think that's the first film, or is certainly one of the very first films that addresses the issue of torture of Americans by the Japanese. And so that's even a year after, Bataan. So
When was that one made?
44 is 44. The Purple Heart.
Because the Guadalcanal Diary, which was made in 42 and released, I think, in 43, late 43. It started in 42, but they talk about the Gotegi Patrol, which were Marines that were lured into a trap by Japanese and executed and mutilated. They do talk about that there. So, which is, again, is fact. That's not a Hollywood make-believe thing. That's a real deal. But anyway, either way. Well, I guess we can start wrapping this up. Did you guys, and I'll start with you, Kim, did you like this film, and would you recommend it?
Oh, definitely. Yeah, I think it's a really interesting movie. It's beautifully shot, so the end of the film certainly stands out. But I would recommend it. Yes.
What about you, Jason?
I would definitely recommend it. I think it was great to see a wartime film, where they didn't know everything, and we really see what, obviously not everything they knew, but what they were willing to put out there. And in this case, they wanted to tell a story about 13 Americans who were in this together, and I think the film in that sense really succeeds. I mean, you really see them come together as a group, even though you know what's going to happen. I mean, the film from the beginning kind of lets you know they're in a hopeless situation. But I think in that sense it really works.
Yeah, I would agree. I agree with both of you. I really liked it. It's beautifully shot. I mean, Tay Garner is a great filmmaker, very economically in how he shot some scene. I mean, you get a sense of tension right away with very few details how he shot. So I would not say that one learns a lot about Bataan per se, because it's such a narrow focus on one unit. So if you want to learn more about Bataan, don't watch that. But if one get a sense of what the experience was, I would definitely recommend it. It's still good. I mean, it's 43. It's still a very enjoyable movie. I had popcorn and I loved it.
Yeah, I would recommend it for many of the reasons that we talked about today. Not the least of which is the depiction of the last stand, if you will, of these guys. And for the reasons that there aren't really a whole heck of a lot of movies made about this era of American involvement in the Second World War. And there's a handful, but none that really address this topic. It's okay. It's not my favorite movie by any means, but it's certainly not my least favorite movie by any means either. Can you guys, Kim? I'll start with you again. Can you wrap this up? Can you sum this movie up in your opinion in a sentence or two? Maybe.
Well, I'll use something that I wanted to talk about earlier. It's a horror film.
Yeah.
In a way. So it's a horror film, a last stand film.
Mm-hmm.
I like the fog.
Really
I like the fog on the ground.
It really is very effective.
Yeah, it's very well done.
Yeah, I would say something, I think, along the lines of what Kim said, that it's an extremely dark film, and it made me want to watch. I think I'm going beyond my one sentence here, but it made me want to go back and look at films like They Died with Their Boots On, the Errol Flynn film. I think that's 41 when that comes out, and it made me think about the Alamo films I saw when I was a kid. That how this film related to that Last Stand kind of genre.
Yeah, good movie too. Died with Their Boots On. Damn good movie. Krista?
I'm going to quote a New York Times review that I thought was very, very well written, just a sentence of it. There's nothing bright or exultant about this new film, except the admiration inspired by the image of brave men hanging on. There's sickening filth and bloodshed in it. Men die with marrow-chilling screams. Death is a grim inevitability.
Wow. I don't know how I can follow that up, but I think very well put.
It's on me. It's a New York Times
I know,
review.
I
want to emphasize
but
that. I did not write that.
Good on you for pulling it out, though. I'll say that. I like to close with a quote, and I'll do so here. We talked about the prologue and the epilogue, and I'm just going to read you the epilogue right now. And it goes, and I quote, "So fought the heroes of Bataan. Their sacrifice made possible our victories in the Coral and Bismarck Seas, at Midway, on New Guinea, and Guadalcanal. Their spirit will lead us back to Bataan. So, with that being said, I want to thank everybody for listening. If you'd like to hear more about the events we discussed today, listen to our mini episode next week, where we will share oral histories from those who were there. You can follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Service on Celluloid. Be sure to rate and review us on iTunes if you like what you hear. I'd like to thank everyone who made this podcast possible, our producer, Tessa Jager, and our sound engineer, Jeremy Burson. This has been a production of the National World War II Museum.